Bueno, vamos a empezar. Bueno, el ponente de hoy es Miguel Ángel Sánchez Conde. Miguel Ángel hizo su licenciatura en Badajoz y en la Universidad de La Laguna, y después fue a Granada para hacer el doctorado que hizo con Paco Prada sobre búsqueda de materia oscura y formación de halo. Y está aquí en el IAC desde el año pasado como postdoc. La charla de hoy es parte de una iniciativa de la cual ahora Miguel Ángel les va a dar más detalles, pero básicamente se trata de dar el mismo material, una especie de review sobre materia oscura en todo el mundo durante esta semana.
Sí, creo que sí, ¿no? Okay, so hello everybody, welcome, thanks for coming. Before starting my talk, I would like to say a few words about this Dark Matter Awareness Week. It was conceived. This is an international initiative that was conceived by mainly by Paolo Salucci and collaborators from CISA in Italy. Although there are now a lot of people involved trying to organize everything all around the world. The main aim of this initiative, at least in my opinion, is to provide to those scientists working in different areas and different approaches of the dark matter problem and improve knowledge of the let's say phenomenology and distribution of dark matter in galaxies. I must say that I'm not working on galaxy structure, so indeed I'm working on dark matter searches. So probably I don't have the ideal profile to give this talk, but in any case I will do my best, of course. And I think that as a second objective, it's also really important to stress how this kind of initiatives can spread and help to spread our current knowledge of dark matter to the rest of the community. No? So here you can see a map of those institutions that are participating in this event all around the world. In total, I think that there are like 150 institutions or so. I have to say that I'm not the only one that is giving the talk at the IAC. Actually, Marc Barcels will give us, I guess, a rather similar talk next week in La Palma. And here I wrote down also the webpage of the event, where you can have access for a lot of information about the Dark Matter Awareness Week. You can even download the reference talk that the organizers provide to the speakers. Some notes, movies, etc. No? So I invite you to have a look. I have to say that this talk. I won't give the reference talk that the organizers provided me because I did some modifications in order to accommodate it to not only to the audience but also even for me. This is the general overview of the talk. First, a brief introduction about the dark matter problem. Then the main bulk of the talk, the phenomenology and distribution of dark matter in galaxies, and then I will finish with a blog about my current research, dark matter searches. I will give you a brief overview of the present status of dark matter searches. So first of all, what's dark matter? Probably one of the best physical ways to introduce the concept is to define a gravitating matter, MR, and a luminous mass distribution, okay, ML, and then these two quantities can be obtained from observations, okay. So what you see is that both mass distributions do not match, no? So there's a mismatch between the gravitating matter and the luminous matter that you see, for example, in a galaxy, no? So we have to introduce a massive dark component, no? And this massive dark component is introduced to account for this disagreement in masses, no? Luminous mass, gravitating mass, no? Its profile, MH here, must obey this equation, which essentially translates what we are talking about in maths. And of course, it's clear that the matter phenomenon can be accurately investigated only if we accurately measure both the luminous and gravitating matter, no? There are many observational evidences of dark matter in the universe at present at all scales, from galactic scales to galaxy cluster scales to cosmological scales. Of course, I don't have the time to enter in detail in each of these observational evidences, but indeed the talk will be focused on this scale, the galactic scale, which is, as I told you, the main aim of the talk. Before continuing with the talk, I thought convenient to briefly introduce at least which is the cosmological model, the standard cosmological model, which is the lambda CDM or lambda cold dark matter paradigm. No? Just a few notes about it. It's settled in the Big Bang scenario, which I guess most of you know quite well. In this lambda cold dark matter model, most of the matter in the universe is in the form of non-baryonic dark matter, which means non-ordinary dark matter. Okay. This dark matter, non-baryonic dark matter, has to be cold in the sense that the dark matter particles have non-relativistic velocities. And this is very important in order to explain, essentially to explain the large scale structure that we see right now. And finally, the model also includes a lambda term, which is the famous cosmological constant lambda term, as I told you, which was included in principle to explain the observation from distant supernova observations. And which seems to point to an accelerating universe at present. No? This table summarizes more or less which is the 21st century state of the art cosmology based on different methods to measure each of these quantities. As I told you, I won't go into the details, of course, but essentially we have a universe where the normal matter is just less than 5% of the total matter energy in the universe. Then this non-baryonic dark matter is around 23%, and like almost 3/4 of the universe are in the form of this mysterious dark energy or lambda term, no, in the model. No? We have a very useful tool to understand the dark matter problem, which is the n-body cosmological simulations. With them, we are able to, for example, to study the large-scale structure, how the cold dark matter halos form and evolve in the universe, the role of substructure in parent halos, and so on. No? So it's important to note that typically they do not include baryonic components. They only include dark matter, non-baryonic dark matter, because it's expected that the baryonic has a negligible role, no, in all this stuff, at least at larger scales. No? One important thing for this talk is that in the lambda CDM model, the dark matter density profile that you obtain from these simulations seem to be roughly the same, no matter independently of the halo mass and the epoch, no, that you are looking at. So this universal dark matter density profile has this form where rho s is a characteristic density and rs is a given scale radius. This density profile is known as Navarro-Ferencz-White profile, or simply NFW profile. And as I told you, it's like a universal dark matter density profile. No? In all this picture, it's important to stress that more massive halos and those formed earlier have the largest overdensities. No? Here I show you an example of one of these simulations, run in this case by Andrei Krasov and their collaborators in Chicago. This is a 43 megaparsec size simulation box of the universe, from the very early universe up to now. No? And as you can see here, well, the structures first, the smaller structures form, and then by merging and accretion of these smaller structures, you get larger structures. No? Furthermore, this structure is you can see that there are some clusters, some filaments. So the dark matter is not distributed homogeneously. Concerning the scales that are of interest for this talk, the galactic scales, there are essentially two groups that recently, in the last few years, simulated Milky Way-sized halos. One of them is Aquarius, and the other is Via Láctea 1 and 2. Aquarius the Aquarius group has the highest mass resolution simulation up to date. They simulated 5 Milky Way halos with different resolutions, and they obtained, concerning the dark matter density profile, they obtained cast profiles but not exactly Navarro-Foden wide profile, rather similar. They are known as Einasto profiles. They are more less cuspy, let's say. But in any case, for mass modeling, there's no difference between this NFW and Einasto profile. For our purposes, it's not so relevant. As for Via Láctea 1 and 2, they simulated 2 Milky Way halos with different cosmologies, slightly different cosmologies, and they obtained cast profiles which are perfectly compatible with this NFW universal dark matter density profile. No? Here you can see 2 snapshots of the simulations. Yeah, I show you. I don't know if you see it very well because of the lights. But this is an animation, a movie coming from the Aquarius group, where you can see how the structure formed, how a Milky Way side halo formed from the very early universe up to now. And yes, you see how the first structures that collapse and form objects are the smaller ones, and then they start. If we go a little bit forward. They start to merge into larger, to form larger halos, larger structures. This could perfectly be the Milky Way, the formation of the Milky Way, for example. No? So what is impressive here is the huge amount of superstructure that you expect to be present in a typical Milky Way halo. No? You see, there is a lot of infill of the smaller substructures that are merging, continuously merging to form this larger halo. We are here at redshift 0.2 per sample. You can see. So this is essentially what's happening, how we think happening the formation of our Milky Way, for example. This is like 2.5 megaparsecs size, more or less. It's the density of the matter density. Here, this is important. As I told you before, these the simulations only include non-baryonic dark matter. So baryons are not included here. The luminous component of the universe is not included here because it's completely negligible. Although at this scale could be a relevant role, but in principle these simulations do not include baryons. No? So what you see here is the density of the matter. The color means density of the matter.
They don't include the electromagnetic interaction of baryons, but the mass of baryons is there.
No.
So they assume that
they only include the dark matter, the non-baryonic dark matter component of the universe, with the correct density for this dark matter. They do not include baryons at all in any form. Yeah. It's negligible in principle, no? So for simplicity, for the sake of simplicity, they just reject the role of baryons at all. Okay, so let's move on, and we will start the main bulk of the talk, which are galaxies. This plot summarizes which could be the realm of galaxies, no? They spread over like 15 orders of magnitude in luminosity. There are 4 types: dwarfs, spirals, ellipticals, and LSBs. They spread over 16 magnitudes per square arc second in surface brightness, as you can see here. And the distribution of luminous matter it depends on the object, no, that you want to study. For example, in spirals, you can distinguish between a stellar disk, a bulge, and a gaseous disk. And in ellipticals and dwarfs, the luminous matter is mainly given by a stellar spheroid. So concerning spirals, the stellar disk are well described. The surface brightness profile of this stellar disk are well described by this expression here, where I0 is the central surface brightness and RD is a given scale radius. For simplicity, we can take that the optical radius of this stellar disk is like 3.2, more or less 3.2 times this scale radius. Here I show you two examples of these surface brightness profiles for two very different objects. As for the gas distribution, there is also a gaseous disk, as I told you. The H1 distribution gives you, at least what we serve, a flattish radial distribution, which is shown here like the red dots. And you can see a lag in the very center of the objects, typically. As for the CO and H2, they are roughly exponential distributed. You can see it here. And in any case, they give you a negligible mass as compared to the mass in the form of H1. There is an important concept in these spirals that will turn out to be really important for understanding the matter problem, which are the rotation curves. They are in principle well characterized by these parameters here: the sky coordinates of the galaxy center, the systematic velocity of the object, circular velocity, and both inclination and azimuth angles. Probably the key ingredient here is the circular velocity, which is typically obtained by spectroscopy, making use of spectroscopy, radio, optical, interferometers. Here I show you, for example, an example of high-quality rotation curve for this object, where this is velocity in kilometers per second, and this is radius in units of the scale radius, and the blue and red points correspond respectively to blue and red shifted velocities according to the Doppler, well-known Doppler effect. No? So there was an early discovery from the optical and H1 observations, rotation curves. Here I show you, for example, the data coming from collected by Rubin and Ford in the 70s, in the early 70s, and by Roberts and Whitehorse in the 75 in red. And as you can see, there is also superimposed some more recent data from Carignan et al. 2006. Okay, and as you can see, what you think here is that the rotation curve that does not follow this velocity. What you think, what you expected in the case that the mass follows the light, just follow the light. If mass follow with the light, you will get something like this, okay? But you are observing this, that the rotation curve in principle remains flat, no? At outer radii. So there is a mass discrepancy between the gravitating matter and the luminous matter, no? Especially at these outer radii. Rubin and collaborators also made the same exercise for different objects, and in all of them they found the same, that at outer radii the discrepancy between the luminous matter, no? The luminous mass distribution and the gravitating matter do not match. No? You can even extend these studies up to larger radii, for example, using H1 kinematics. No? And again, these rotation curves do not decline in a Keplerian way, as one would expect, no? Beyond the optical radius. The optical radius is given here by these red marks, okay? And as you can see, the rotation curves still remain flat up to very, very large radius, no? Compared to the optical radius in each object. So, again, we have a problem. We have a clear mass discrepancy between both kinds of the luminous matter and the gravitating matter that you feel here. No? In this plot, I show you the mass to light ratio, the local mass to light ratio versus the radius of the object. And in a case of non-dark matter, in principle you would expect a mass to light ratio which will be constant with the radius. No? But you are taking mass to light ratio that increase with the increasing radius. No? So again, this mass discrepancy emerges as a disagreement between the light and the mass distributions. It is possible to talk about a universal rotation curve. If you make this kind of studies for a good sample of galaxies, what you see is that the rotation curves are more or less the same, and they only depend, roughly speaking, they only depend on the magnitude of the galaxy. Here, for example, Salucci and collaborators use a sample of 3,200 individual rotation curves, and what you can see is that it depends mainly on the luminosity of the object. This is more or less the same, but for individual objects, from lower luminosities to high luminosities. You can see the rotation curves are slightly changing depending on the luminosity of the object. So, taking into account all these previous slides, it's clear that we have to include to correctly model the mass distribution in spirals. You have to include all the ingredients, no? Dark matter that is expected to be present there, then the disk, the disk component, and the gas, no? For dark matter, for example, you have to assume a density profile that you can use the Navarro-White profile that is obtained from simulations. The velocity of the disk is given, for example, by I-band photometry observations, no? And the velocity of the gas, you can obtain them from observation of the distribution of H1, for example. So here I show you a result of one of these mass modelings, no, for this object. This is the total, okay, the total, this is kilometers per second, and this is radius. So this is the total circular velocity that you measure, and then your model, no? The disk, the contribution from the disk, the contribution for the gas, and the contribution from the halo. As you see, the dominant component comes from the halo, no? Especially at larger radii, no? This is more or less the same exercise, but for objects with different luminosities. Those objects with the lowest luminosities, in those objects with the lowest luminosities, what you see is that the halo is the dominant component, no? On the contrary, in the object with the highest luminosity, what you see is that the disk the main component in this mass modeling, and the halo is now as a dominant component. So it depends on the luminosity also of the object, as we saw in the previous slides. So a consequence of this is that the smaller galaxies are denser and have a higher dark matter proportion. Moving to ellipticals. Modeling elliptical, in order to model elliptical, you have again to measure the light profile, which in this case is well described by a stellar spheroid, as I told you before. You have to derive the total mass profile, and you can do it by means of dispersion velocity of stars, or even using planetary nebulae. You also can derive the total mass profile from X-ray observations of the emitting hot gas. And you can even combine weak and strong lensing in order to derive this mass profile. In any case, in ellipticals, is quite hard compared to spirals to disentangle between the dark and stellar components. We will see in a few seconds. Concerning the stellar spheroid, the surface brightness of these ellipticals follows a Sersiv-de-Vaucouleurs law of this form, where R is the half-light radius of the object, and N is a degree of the concentration of the light in this stellar spheroid. By projecting this surface brightness profile, you obtain the luminosity density, JR here, and then by assuming a given mass to light ratio, which is typically taken as constant in these objects, you can get the density of the spheroid. As I told you, there are some difficulties in modeling these ellipticals. Here, for example, this plot shows the modeling of a giant elliptical using typical parameters. And what you can see, this is apparent dispersion velocity, okay? So as you can see, this is the total, what you measure, and this is the contribution coming from stars, just from stars. So the stars clearly dominate the total, no? The total contribution in the aperture dispersion velocity. So it doesn't matter which kind of dark matter density profile you are using here, NFW or a core profile or whatever, you more or less obtain the same. So the dark matter profile is not well resolved here, as the stars dominate, especially in the inner regions of the elliptical. Weak and strong lensing give you more or less the same results. In blue is the total, again the total, something like the total dispersion velocity that you measure, and then the contribution of stars is given by this purple line here, and the contribution coming from the dark matter density profile that you're using is this one. As you can see, in the inner regions of the galaxy, the contribution is mainly due to stars, and only in the outer regions you can feel the dark matter density profile that you use. So again, core and cast profiles of the dark matter doesn't affect the total result. As I told you, you can also obtain the mass profiles of ellipticals from X-ray observations. Essentially, what you do is to assume hydrostatic equilibrium in these ellipticals, and then you can use this equation here. From X-rays, you can obtain the temperature profile as well as the gas density profile. Here, for example, two samples of objects observing X-rays, and then you get a result like this, where I plot the mass to light ratio versus the radius. In the inner regions of the elliptical, what you see is that the mass to light ratio is constant, which means that dark matter, if it is there, it's not quite important. But in the outer regions, the mass to light ratio starts to increase. So there's a clear discrepancy between the luminous mass and the gravitating mass that you measure there in the outer regions. So what about dwarfs? The basic properties of these objects are these ones. Typical luminosities of the order of 10 to the 3 to 10 to the 7. Solar luminosities, more or less. The dispersion velocity around these values, from 7 to 12 kilometers per second, typically. The half-life radius is of a few hundred parsecs. Most of them are low luminosity gas-free satellites of the Milky Way and M31, and they present very large mass to light ratios of the order of 10 to 100 or even more, depending on the object. As far as we know, they are the smallest stellar systems that contain the matter, but they don't only contain the matter, but also they are the most matter-dominated systems known in the universe. In this plot, I show you dwarfs and globular clusters. The typical luminosities of both objects versus the radius, the half-life radius. And as you can see, there are some dwarfs that seem to share some properties with respect to those in globular clusters, found in globular clusters. But the main difference is the half-life radius. As you can see, the half-life radius in dwarfs are typically much higher than in globular clusters, meaning that in order to have these huge velocity dispersions, you need a lot of dark matter there. These are the typical dispersion velocity profiles for these objects. For some of these objects, these are classical dwarfs, well-known dwarfs or the satellites of the Milky Way. Again, this is kilometers per second, the dispersion velocity that you measure at Earth, and this is radius. No? What you see is that the fit. Okay, in dotted line, what you see is that what you should obtain in the case that mass follow with light. In the case that there was no dark matter there, no? But it's difficult to explain this data, the fit to this data, without dark matter. As you can see, you need a lot of dark matter in order to explain the dispersion velocity profiles. The mass profiles in dwarfs are typically obtained by means of the Jeans equation, which relates the kinematics. Here is the dispersion velocity. The light, here is the surface brightness profile, and the underlying dark matter distribution, of course. Essentially, what you do is to make assumptions on the velocity anisotropy, and then you fit this dispersion profile, and you get something like that. No? These are the dark matter density profiles for different dwarfs, satellites of the Milky Way, for a sample of dwarfs. The results seems to point to chord dark matter density profiles in these dwarfs. I remember you that according to simulations, you get more cusp dark matter density profiles. So it seems to be some conflict between the simulations and what you observe. No? For example, in these objects in dwarfs. It's also important to stress that there is a degeneracy between the dark matter density profile in these objects and the velocity anisotropy, in the sense that both cusp and chord dark matter density profiles equally fit the data. In principle, they fit the data equally well, and this is because of that. Because you can play with the velocity anisotropy. For example, a cusp dark matter density profile plus a given velocity anisotropy gives you a chord dark matter density profile. So there is a clear degeneracy between both dark matter density profile and velocity anisotropy. However, the experts working in this field seem to prefer chord dark matter density profiles, as they seem to be more less in conflict with what you expect by extrapolating those structural parameters coming from spiral and ellipticals. And finally, let me just mention also what could be a quite interesting result, which is the possibility to have a minimum dark matter halo mass. In this plot, I show you the mass within the inner 300 parsecs in these objects versus the luminosity of the object. These are essentially all the satellite dwarfs that we have in the Milky Way at this moment, no? That we know at this moment. As you can see, the mass within these inner 300 parsecs is around 10 to the 7 solar masses, independently of the luminosity of the object. This is a very interesting result, in my opinion. So, seem to point to at least a minimum halo mass, independently of the amount of stars that you have in these objects. No? And finally, let me give you a few notes about some information about the dark matter searches, the present status of dark matter searches. So this is the general picture that we have. Essentially, the luminous matter that we see in a galaxy is just a tiny fraction of the amount, the total amount of matter that you expect in these objects. Indeed, for example, for a Milky Way size halo, the dark matter halo is about 10 times larger in radius than the visible galaxy. But up to now, we didn't say anything about the dark matter particle. As we know, most of the matter in the universe must be in the form of non-baryonic dark matter. We know the requirements that these dark matter particles have to meet. Okay. So they have to be weakly interacting with the ordinary matter, because otherwise we should have, we should have discovered them in laboratory very early, no? So they should have long lived enough for having presence since the early universe. Of course, it has to be cold, especially and more specifically to explain the scale structure, the large scale structure that we see in the universe today. It has to be massive enough to account for the total dark matter content that we expect to be present in the universe. And of course, it has to be consistent with observations and the present constraints of the different experiments. Particle physics provide us a huge plethora of dark matter, of possible candidates. However, the standard model of particle physics does not provide any viable candidate. Okay, so it is necessary to go beyond the standard model of particle physics, to go, for example, to supersymmetry, in order to get some very good candidates, in principle, that fulfill all these requirements. For example, the axions, some such candidates like the neutralinos, axinos, gravitinos, Kaluza-Klein particles, etc. Probably the preferred candidate right now in the community is the neutralino, with a mass around few dozens GeVs, few hundred GeVs or so, in this range more or less. Dark matter searches are typically divided in three categories, depending on the approach that you use in the problem. No? In the red detection, what you try to measure is the nuclei recoil energy after the scattering of dark matter particles on target nuclei. In indirect detection, what you try to do is to search for dark matter annihilation products like positrons, neutrinos, gammas, etc. Okay, in this case, you are assuming that dark matter particle is its own antiparticle. Okay, so when they meet each other, they just annihilate, and they give you some annihilation products like neutrinos, positrons, gammas, etc. And this is what we are trying to detect with this technique. There is a third possibility, which is the direct production of these dark matter particles at the lab, like for example at the LHC in CERN. No? I'm mainly working on these gamma ray searches in the second case, in the detection, and I'm trying to detect dark matter particles using Cherenkov telescopes and satellites in gamma rays, no? Like for example Fermi, or Cherenkov telescopes like MAGIC, for example in La Palma, HESS, Veritas, Kangaroo, etc. Here I give you some the crucial parameters of both kinds of instruments. It's important to note especially that they are completely complementary in energy range, where Fermi more or less can observe up to 300 GeV or so, and typical Cherenkov telescopes start to operate at these energies approximately. The energy solution is probably quite better in Fermi, and there is a very good characteristic of Fermi that makes this satellite very interesting for dark matter searches, which is the fact that it has a huge field of view, where only one pointing gives you 1/6 of the sky, of the total sky. This is in contrast to the small field of view of Cherenkov telescopes, like 4 degrees or so. The angular resolution is rather similar in both instruments at these energies, at 100 GeV or so. So these are the leading Cherenkov telescopes that are in the world at present. MAGIC, which has 2 telescopes, 17 meters diameter each, in La Palma, of course. Veritas in the US, 4 telescopes. HESS, which is a German experiment, essentially, but it's located in Namibia with 4 telescopes. And Kangaroo 3 in Australia, also 4 telescopes. But smaller than the MAGIC ones, quite smaller. This is the gamma ray, centering the rest of the talk in gamma rays. This is the gamma ray dark matter annihilation flux that you expect from dark matter annihilation. Essentially, this flux above a given energy threshold of the telescope is given by the product of these 2 terms, where the first of them encloses all the particle physics that is in the problem, and the second one takes into account all the astrophysical consideration. Dark matter density profiles, the PSF, geometrical considerations, etc. No? So, concerning the present status of gamma ray dark matter searches only in galaxies, since this is the main topic of the talk, Cherenkov telescopes already observed some dwarf galaxies in the context of dark matter searches. For example, HESS observed Sagittarius. MAGIC observed Draco and Wilma 1, and it's also observing Segi 1. Veritas observed more or less the same than MAGIC, and also Ursa Minor. Up to now, no signal was found, of course. And indeed, it seems that we are quite far from detection according to theoretical models, no? That gives you an estimate of the flux, no? of the expected flux at Earth. HESS also observed the galactic center of the Milky Way with similar results. As for the Fermi satellite, after 2 years of data, they analyzed in detail and in the context of dark matter 10 dwarfs, probably the best candidates among all the dwarfs, and again no signal was found. The upper limits that they get are rather similar than the one that we are getting from Cherenkov telescopes as well. So they are not so good at the end. Concerning direct detection, as I told you here, what you try to measure is the energy of the nucleus, no? After the scattering of one of these dark matter particles with a target nucleus in the laboratory. The idea is that we are embedded, no? in the local dark matter halo. So you expect a dark matter density here, no? in this room, for example. So what you are trying to measure is this scattering between this dark matter particle and a target nuclei, no? in the laboratory. The problem, of course, is this: we are dealing with very small energies and very high backgrounds. Depending on the channel, on the approach that you are using for this direct detection, there are different experiments that are right now running all around the world. There are a lot of experiments, a lot of activities in this field. It's a very active field, indeed. And this plot more or less summarizes the current situation in direct detection. In this plot, what you see is the cross section of the interaction between the dark matter particle and the nucleus that you are using, and the mass of the dark matter particle. No, it's electroweak. It's weak. No. They interact also weakly, no? Weak force also. But the cross section is very, very small. But still there is some consection. No? That's what we are trying to measure here. So in this plot, the shaded area, the shaded region, correspond to allowed particle physics models, no, for the matter particle. And these lines correspond to exclusion lines as given by the running experiments. So above each of these lines, the particle physics models are excluded. No? As you can see, even in the future, because these experiments are still projected, are not running. So as you can see, there is still a lot of work to do. No? We still have a lot of particle physics models spanning over some orders of magnitude in cross-section that it is necessary to check. And yeah, finally, just a few words about the multi-dark consolidator project. All of these activities, all of these different approaches that were given in this talk are well covered by the multi-dark team, I think. This is a multi-dark consolidator. It's a Spanish consolidator that was approved last December with a duration of 5 years or so. And I'm very happy to tell you that I think that the project is working very well. There is a lot of activity. There is in every working group, every package, let's say. And yeah, hope to let's see how it works. But we still have money and time to discover this or this dark matter. No, I invite you to have a look to the web page of the multi-dark consortium for further information. So that's it. Yeah. So let's please stay tuned and hope to give you more fresh news about this topic in the near future. Thank you.
Yes, you haven't mentioned the possible alternative of Mond, the modified Newtonian dynamics. So please do.
Okay. Mond, I think that has some problems, no? Yeah, sure. But still, I think that Mond has more problems than in lambda cold dark matter. No? For example, in lambda cold dark matter, at least you can explain with the same set of parameters, more or less, no? And different phenomena at different scales, no? At T scales, up to cosmological scales. But this is not the case for Mond. No? Mond can explain, for example, a given phenomenology at a given scale, for example, galactic scale. But then it fails to explain, for example, the large scale structure of the universe. And you have to be able to explain, no? to build a model to explain both kinds of things, or not only both, a lot of things, a lot of phenomenology, no?
The galaxy scale?
No, in the same form. Even the more refined Mond theories, like Tebes, for example, gives you a more or less quite good explanation at galactic scales and medium scales, let's say, galaxy cluster scales. But still, for example, they need for some dark matter component at the end. So they are animating the problem of dark matter by
neutrinos,
for example. Yeah. So they are including dark matter at the end, but in a different way, no? Let's say. But still they are including dark matter, and they are building a completely alternative theory, no, to Newtonian dynamics. No? So, in my opinion, at least there's too much work to do.
I'm not in particular in favor of Mond, so I think Mond has a lot of problems, and it's not a nice theory. It's an effective theory also, and I think dark matter is more physically motivated. But there are many things that you have shown on that plot that are really weird. For example, if you go back to the where you were talking about the minimum halo mass. Okay. So, for example, this is an example of something new, relatively new, that it's well explained within the Mond theory, in the sense that you expect that lower the luminosity, less the gravity, and at some point the gravity is irrelevant because you reach this asymptotic limit of the Mond value. And this is something that you see always. So whatever the answer is at the end of this all this phenomenology, it is clear that the dark matter should explain why below some acceleration, okay, the dark matter is still behaving like this. So this is a conspiracy very difficult to understand.
So, excuse me. So I have two questions. One about looking if we are in the particle model like SUSY, and if we want to make a scan of parameters, do you have an idea of how many time it takes to do that? I mean, without constraint from LHC or indirect dark matter. First, the time it takes, and then if we are looking the particle model, we can easily make a model without annihilation, without particle, standard particle visible. So, what's the possibility for astrophysical to look for dark matter without signal from particle? That's it.
Yeah. For the second question, I think that we have a problem in astrophysics. Our tool is light, no? So if you have a dark matter particle which doesn't give you a product that we can measure at Earth with our telescopes, we have a problem. No? We are in a problem. So I don't know if you are aware about this dark matter decay, particles. This can be also an interesting possibility. But in any case, they yield gammas. Still, they yield gammas. No? So in principle, we can still scan and check these models. But of course, if these dark matter products don't produce light, at least from astrophysics, I think that is quite it's impossible.
I mean, there is no test we can manage or think to do without detection. I mean, because in the case of annihilation, we want annihilation. Mm-hmm. So the model we have annihilation, but it's an artifact. We want annihilation. When you are showing the simulation about dark matter, you have no assumption about dark matter, because I think the smallest part of your N-body simulation is like mass solar or a bit less. I mean, it's a huge particle. Let's say maybe we are dealing with super particle. Mm-hmm. So there is no idea. I mean, to check the gravity or I don't know.
A good example of this is, for example, that the particle physics provides you a lot of possible candidates, spanning over like 90 orders of magnitude in mass, and astrophysics cannot say anything about that. So we cannot rule out any kind of mass, no, for this dark matter particle. So again, I don't think that. So this is why we assume that the dark matter particle is annihilating, no, and giving you some products, the annihilating products. But this is as you know, this is well motivated by particle physics as well. It's not a crazy thing, no, at all. And the first question, I don't remember.
You need to make a scan of the parameters, because if you are dealing with standard particle physics model, you have a parameter space parameter, so you need to.
So for example, here, no?
For example, yeah.
Yeah.
And if
these limits, these exclusion limits, can be reached by these experiments after just 1 year, or even a little bit, maybe 1-2 years of experiment. Once the experiment is ready, in 1-2 years they can rule out all this portion about the exclusion lines. And for the LHC, it's more or less the same.
Detector like, because for sure in this case you have direct collision is not the same, but annihilation. I mean,
okay.
You can make.
Yeah. So in the case of Cherenkov telescopes, I can show you. Give me just 1 second. I think there's something. Lo de la fuente, a lo mejor, ¿no?